Good evening, dear listeners, and a very warm welcome to you all. Wherever you are tuning in from tonight, maybe cozied up in bed, listening from your favorite quiet corner at home, or perhaps relaxing somewhere peaceful with the world fading away outside, I'm so glad you've joined me here. Take a slow, deep breath. Let your shoulders drop. Maybe pull the covers up a bit higher and feel the day gently slip away. Let the story begin. It was a thick November fog on the Thames, the kind that swallowed every sound except the lap of black water against stone. A young man, promising, principled, left his club at 11, walking home across Westminster Bridge. He never arrived. Dawn found his body on the mud below. Watch stopped at 11:30, pockets untouched, but one vital packet of secret letters gone. Scotland Yard called it accident. Sir Reginald Hargrove knew better. He came to Baker Street at night, voice low. "Mr. Holmes, my nephew was murdered, and the killer left no trace except the ones only you can see." Within the hour, we were on the embankment, fog curling around the gas lamps, the river whispering secrets it refused to give up. What waited beneath that bridge was darker than drowning, and far more personal. The game was afoot. Chapter 1. A case presents itself. It was a raw November evening in 1892, the kind when London seemed to shrink beneath a shroud of yellow fog. Oh, the air tasted of coal dust and river mud, sharp enough to catch in the throat, while the gas lamps along Baker Street burned with sickly halos that barely reached the curb. Hansom cabs clattered past, their wheels hissing on whetstone, and somewhere nearby a barrel organ wheezed a melancholy tune that the fog swallowed almost at once. The chill had driven most sensible folk indoors, yet at 221B the fire roared cheerfully, and the sitting room smelled of Virginia tobacco, old leather, and the faint metallic tang of Holmes's chemical experiments. I had returned from a dull afternoon at Paddington Station, where I had seen off an elderly patient bound for the south coast, and found Holmes in one of his restless moods. He stood at the window, long fingers drumming against the pane, pipe clenched between his teeth, sending thin blue streamers curling toward the ceiling. The violin rested neglected on its chair. Even its dark wood seemed to share his impatience. For days he had complained of the monotony of crime, as though murder and theft were mere diversions that had temporarily lost their flavor. The knock came at 8:30. 3 firm raps, decisive rather than desperate. Mrs. Hudson announced Sir Reginald Hargrove, Member of Parliament, and showed in a tall man whose ulster dripped onto the turkey carpet. He was perhaps 50, with iron-grey hair and a close-trimmed beard. His eyes were tired but alert. He declined the offer of brandy and seated himself without ceremony. "Mr. Holmes," he began, voice low and measured, "my nephew, Edmund Hargrove, was found dead this morning beneath Westminster Bridge. The coroner's preliminary verdict is accidental drowning." A young man unsteady on his feet after drink, slipping from the embankment steps into the tide. "I am here because I believe it was neither accident nor misadventure." Holmes had moved to his favorite chair, and now sat with fingertips together, regarding our visitor with that peculiar stillness that always put me in mind of a pointer-scenting game. "Details, Sir Reginald," he said quietly. Edmund, 26, had lately returned from 3 years as an attaché in Calcutta. He carried with him private correspondence, copies of letters between a minor Indian prince and certain London financiers concerning railway concessions and alleged bribes. Edmund had confided to his uncle that he feared the documents might be suppressed by force. 2 nights earlier, he had dined at the Westminster Conservative Club with 3 men, Lord Ashford, whose firm stood to profit handsomely from the railways, Victor Crane, a radical journalist eager for a scandal, and Captain Elias Thorne, late of the Bengal Lancers, now on half pay, but still consulted by the War Office on Indian affairs. Edmund Left the club at 11, Sir Reginald continued. He chose to walk home along the embankment despite the fog. He never reached his lodgings in Vincent Square. At first light, a waterman found him face down on the foreshore mud below the bridge. Watch stopped at 11:30. Pockets untouched. Money, keys, watch chain, all present. Yet the packet of documents he carried in an inner pocket was gone. I poured myself a small whiskey. The glass was cold against my palm. The fire snapped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Holmes leaned forward. No signs of violence. Bruises on the arms and knees, consistent, so the police surgeon says, with a fall. Then no knife wounds, no strangulation marks. The Yard has already spoken of closing the file. Another riverside tragedy, they call it. But Edmund was temperate in his habits, and he had every reason to live. He spoke to me, only last week, of a shadow that follows me across the bridge at night. He laughed when he said it, yet the laughter was forced. Holmes rose and crossed to the mantel, taking down his lens. "You have the body still?" "At the Westminster mortuary until tomorrow noon." "Then we shall view it at first light, together with the place where he was found. Meanwhile, describe these 3 dinner companions." Sir Reginald did so with precision. Lord Ashford, portly, prosperous, red-faced, inclined to bluster. Crane, thin, intense, eyes restless behind steel spectacles. Captain Thorne, tall, scarred across one cheek, limping slightly from an old wound, spoke little but watched much. All 3 had remained at the club after Edmund departed. All 3 had interests that the missing letters might threaten. I confess I noticed nothing particularly remarkable in Sir Reginald's manner, though perhaps you, dear reader, were more observant than I in that first hour. He seemed a man genuinely grieved, yet there was a careful weighing of every phrase, as though he feared saying too much or too little. Within the quarter hour, we were descending the stairs. Holmes, shrugging into his greatcoat, a hansom waited at the curb. The horse stamped and steamed in the cold. Big Ben struck the hour as we rattled across the river, its bronze voice muffled and mournful in the fog. The embankment lamps glowed like drowned moons. The Thames lapped blackly against the granite. At the mortuary, the air was bitter with carbolic and the faint, sickly sweetness that no disinfectant can entirely banish. Edmund Hargrove lay on a slab beneath a single gas jet. His face was pale and swollen from the water. River mud clung to his hair and collar. Holmes bent close, examining first the hands. The palms showed faint scrapes, as though clutching at rough stone. Beneath the fingernails lay traces of reddish clay. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "This is not the grey Thames silt one expects below Westminster. It is iron-bearing, such as one finds nearer the foundries at Vauxhall. Yet the body lay half a mile downstream." I peered at the small smear. "He might have walked upstream before the mishap, or been conveyed thereafter." Holmes lifted the sodden coat cuff. A small tear showed threads pulled outward. On the collar was a faint discoloration, almost invisible in the poor light. "A chemical trace. Sharp, acrid. I shall require better light and my reagents at Baker Street." We left the cold room as the sky began to pale. Outside, gulls wheeled above the river, their cries thin and desolate. Holmes paused at the parapet near the bridge's southern approach and stared down into the sliding black water. "The bridge remembers more than men do," he said softly, "and the river gives up its dead, but not always its secrets." I felt a prickle along my spine that had little to do with the cold. What awaited us in the days ahead I could scarcely have imagined. The mystery had presented itself. A young man dead, sensitive papers vanished, 3 men with motive and opportunity, and Scotland Yard, content to call it accident. Holmes, however, he had already seen what others missed. We turned back toward Baker Street as the first thin light of morning touched the spires, and I knew that whatever shadow had followed Edmund Hargrove across Westminster Bridge was now our quarry as well. Chapter 2. into London streets. The following morning broke cold and clear, the fog having retreated to leave a pale sun that did little to warm the bones. The Thames still exhaled its familiar stench, sewage, tar, and the faint metallic bite of iron from upstream foundries, while the embankment rang with the clatter of drays and the shouts of lightermen. Breakfast at Baker Street had been hasty. Toast, bitter marmalade that puckered the tongue, and strong tea that steamed in the chill air of the sitting-room. Holmes was already coated and hatted when I came down. His eyes held that bright, predatory gleam I knew too well. "We begin at the club," he said. "Then follow the threads wherever they lead. The day promises movement, Watson." The Westminster Conservative Club stood solid and respectable against the river, its windows reflecting the grey water like mirrors. Inside, the air was warmer, heavy with the scent of cigar tobacco, beeswax polish, and the faint must of old Morocco bindings. The steward, a discreet man named Poole, remembered the dinner clearly. "Mr. Hargrove left at 11 sharp, sir," he told us in the quiet smoking room. Seemed in good spirits, though preoccupied. No, he refused a cab. Said the walk would do him good despite the fog. The other gentleman remained another half-hour at least. Lord Ashford we found next, in his spacious study off Grosvenor Square. The room smelled of wood smoke and old port. A fire crackled behind a heavy brass fender. Ashford received us expansively, though his small eyes were watchful. He was a stout man in his late 50s, cheeks flushed from breakfast or temper. "Tragic affair," he rumbled, offering cigars we declined. Young Hargrove had promise. We differed sharply on the railway question, subsidies, guarantees. But murder? Absurd. I stayed here till past midnight playing whist. Ask any of the 4 men at my table. His boots shone with fresh blacking. No trace of river mud clung to the welts. Yet on the mantel stood a small bronze figure of an Indian elephant, its howdah inlaid with what looked like real gold. From Mayfair, we rattled down to Fleet Street in a hansom, the horses' hooves striking sparks from the cobbles. Victor Crane's office crouched above a noisy printer's shop. The air reeked of hot lead, ink, and damp newsprint. Presses thudded rhythmically below like a mechanical heartbeat. Crane himself was spare and intense, steel spectacles glinting as he looked up from a littered desk. Hargrove dangled a story before me. He said, without preamble, corruption in Calcutta, bribes to secure railway contracts. He promised me the letters. When he died, the story died with him. Convenient, wouldn't you agree? For certain vested interests? His fingers were stained blue-black with ink, but steady. He met Holmes's gaze without flinching. Captain Elias Thorne proved harder to find. We tracked him at last to a modest club near St. James's Square, a dim, panelled place that smelled of stale port, wet wool, and the faint tang of gun oil. Thorne sat alone in a corner, a half-empty glass untouched before him. A livid scar ran from temple to jaw, his left leg stretched stiffly beneath the table. "I said little at dinner," he answered in a low rasp. "Edmund talked too freely of matters best left quiet. After he left, I finished my brandy and took a cab home to Pimlico. That's all." His limp was pronounced when he rose to see us out. "Old shrapnel," he muttered. But his boots, though polished, showed faint traces of reddish clay along one heel, quickly concealed as he turned. Consider the fact as we knew them at that hour. The watch stopped at 11:30. The missing packet of letters, the reddish clay under Edmund's nails, and now, perhaps, on Thorne's boot. The faint, chemical trace Holmes had noted on the collar. 3 men had dined with him. 3 had motive: financial, journalistic, military. Which would you suspect first? We spent the afternoon on the embankment itself. The wind carried the clang of ships' bells, the creak of cranes, the hoarse cries of gulls circling above the brown water. Holmes knelt at the stone steps nearest where the body had been found, scraping samples of mud into small envelopes with his penknife. The silt was cold and gritty between gloved fingers. "Red clay again," he observed, holding a pinch to the light. "Iron-rich upstream origin. And here," he pointed to a short length of dark wool fibre caught on the iron railing. "Not from Hargrove's overcoat. Someone else stood here." Our final call was a small photography studio near Charing Cross, suggested by Crane as a place Edmund had visited 2 days earlier. The proprietor, a nervous Mr. Blackwood, met us amid the sharp reek of acetic acid and silver nitrate. Big glass plates dried on racks. The darkroom door stood ajar, exhaling chemical fumes. "Mr. Hargrove came for cabinet portraits," Blackwood insisted. "Nothing more." Yet Holmes, moving quietly among the drying prints, paused before a discarded negative on a side table. Holding it to the light, he revealed faint reversed script, official seals, Indian crests, fragments of typewritten text. "He photographed his copies," Holmes said softly, "prudent under the circumstances." The afternoon was waning. Fog began to creep back from the river, softening the gas lamps into yellow smudges. We returned to Baker Street in silence, the day's impressions crowding my mind. The rich tobacco of clubrooms, the sharp ink of print shops, the bite of developers in darkrooms, the ever-present rot of the Thames, clinging to everything. Holmes sat by the fire, in pipe drawing steadily, eyes half-closed in thought. I confess, the various threads left me bewildered. The reader may fare better with these scattered facts laid before him. As the clock struck 6, a telegram arrived from Sir Reginald. Lord Ashford's whist party was confirmed by 4 unimpeachable witnesses. Crane had been seen at his office till 1 in the morning. Captain Thorne remained unaccounted for after 11. The questions multiplied with every step we took. The net was spreading, yet the centre of the mystery still lay hidden beneath the river's dark surface. Chapter 3. Deeper Waters. The third morning after Edmund Hargrove's death dawned raw and blustery, with a wind off the estuary that carried the salt sting of the sea mixed with the perpetual sourness of the Thames. Low tide had exposed broad shelves of mud along the foreshore below Westminster Bridge. The river lapped sluggishly at the granite steps, leaving behind glistening ribbons of silt that gleamed like wet pewter under a sky the colour of old pewter. Gulls screamed overhead, wheeling in restless circles, while the distant rumble of trains crossing Hungerford Bridge vibrated through the stonework. The air tasted faintly of iron and decay. Holmes had insisted we return to the exact spot where the waterman found the body. He moved with careful precision across the treacherous mud, boots sinking with soft sucking sounds, his ulster flapping like dark wings. I followed more gingerly, the cold seeping through my soles, despite thick socks. He paused near a cluster of broken oyster shells and bent low, magnifying lens in gloved hand. "Here," he said quietly, and with the tip of his penknife lifted a small shattered glass phial half buried in the silt. The fragments were thin and clear. A few drops of colourless liquid still clung inside, evaporating even as we watched. Holmes sniffed delicately, then held the shard toward me. "Prussic acid, Watson, or what remains of it. The faint almond odour emerges when it mingles with river water and organic decay." I caught the scent myself, bitter almonds, unmistakable once recognised, cutting through the heavier reek of mud and sewage. My stomach turned slightly. "Poison?" I asked. "Administered somehow before the fall or during it. The body showed no obvious injection marks, no froth at the mouth, beyond what river water might explain. Yet prussic acid acts with fearful speed. Convulsions, collapse, a death within minutes, if the dose is sufficient." He wrapped the shards carefully in his handkerchief and pocketed them. "We trace its origin. But first observe the surrounding mud." He pointed to a series of shallow depressions leading from the steps toward the water's edge, irregular, as though someone had been dragged or had staggered. Nearby, caught on a jagged stone, hung a short length of dark wool fibre, identical in colour and texture to the one he had found on the bridge railing the day before. Someone stood here with him, Holmes murmured, gripped the collar, see the pull on the fabric here, and perhaps forced the dose down or held him until the poison took hold, then a final push into the tide. We climbed back to the embankment promenade. The wind whipped at our faces, my cheeks stung with cold. B. Holmes paced the length of the bridge's southern approach, studying the iron railings painted the same parliamentary green. He stopped at a spot directly above where the body had lain and leaned over, staring into the sliding black water below. "The drop is not great, perhaps 20 feet at low tide," he said. "A healthy man might survive the fall and swim ashore, but a man already convulsing from hydrocyanic acid, he would sink like lead." We took luncheon at a small chop house near the bridge, a low-ceilinged place smelling of grilled kidneys, onions, and spilled ale. The food was hot and savoury, the ale sharp on the tongue after the chill outside. Over plates of steak and kidney pudding, Holmes laid out his reasoning in that calm, measured tone he reserved for such moments. The collar stain we noted in the mortuary, faint but persistent, is consistent with prussic acid, reacting with certain wool dyes. The tear in the cuff suggests a sudden, violent grip. The mud under the nails and on the boots is upstream clay, not the central Thames silt. Therefore, he did not simply slip from these steps. He was poisoned elsewhere, likely near the club or on his walk, weakened, dragged or half-carried to a point upstream, then pushed from a quieter spot to make the death appear a simple misadventure on the bridge. He paused to light his pipe. The match flared briefly, sending a curl of sulphur into the air. "You recall the affair of the retired colourman in Chelsea, Watson? Poison administered at his own table, death ascribed to apoplexy until we examined the garden boots. Traces of flowerbed soil on a man who never gardened," told the tale. "Here, the river itself bears witness. The mud remembers every step, or drag, taken upon it." I didn't understand then, though I fancy some readers may already have guessed the method's cruel simplicity. Complications followed swiftly. A telegram reached us at Baker Street that afternoon, delivered by a breathless boy whose cap dripped with melting sleet. Sir Reginald wrote that Lord Ashford's whist party had been confirmed by 4 unimpeachable members. The peer had not left the card room until after 1. Victor Crane produced a printer's timesheet showing him correcting proofs until well past midnight. Captain Thorne, however, remained unaccounted for after leaving the club at 11:30. His landlady reported he had not returned home until nearly 2 in the morning, coat-sodden, limping more heavily than usual. Holmes read the message twice, then folded it neatly and placed it on the mantel beside the Persian slipper that held his tobacco. "The net narrows," he said, "yet still allows room for deception. We must press Thorne directly and examine that photography studio again. If Edmund photographed his documents as insurance, the negatives may still exist." Outside, the wind had risen to a low moan. Rain began to spatter against the window panes, driven sideways by the gale. The fire hissed as stray drops found their way down the chimney. I confess that at that moment, the various clues, the clay, the fibres, the shattered file, the chemical trace, seemed to point in several directions at once. In hindsight, the signs were there, plain for anyone with eyes sharper than mine. We sat in silence for some minutes, Holmes' steepled fingers beneath his chin, eyes half closed. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily. Somewhere in the fog-bound city, I thought, the truth lay hidden, waiting only for the right pressure to bring it to the surface. The deeper waters of this affair had begun to stir. Chapter 4. Shadows and Suspicions. And the afternoon following our discovery of the prussic acid file brought a sudden, drenching rain that turned the streets of London into glistening black mirrors. Water poured from eaves and brimmed in gutters. The air tasted clean for once, washed free of coal smoke, though the Thames still carried its low, rotten undertone. Holmes and I spent the hours between 3 and 7 moving through a succession of brief and pointed interviews, each adding its own shade to the growing picture. First we returned to the Westminster Conservative Club, this time seeking the waiter who had served the dinner party. Jenkins was a thin, stoop-shouldered man of middle years, apron still tied, hands red from hot water. In the dim service corridor behind the dining room, he spoke in hushed tones over the clink of silver being stacked. "Mr. Hargrove drank only claret, sir. One glass, barely touched. The others had whiskey or brandy. No one passed anything unusual to his plate or glass that I saw, but Captain Thorne did offer him a cigarette just before he left. Turkish, strong-smelling. Mr. Hargrove accepted one, smoked half, then stubbed it out rather quickly." Holmes's eyes sharpened. You noticed nothing odd in his manner afterward?" "He coughed once or twice, said the smoke was stronger than he liked. Then he rose, wished the company good night, and went." We left the club and crossed to Pimlico in a growler cab, the horses' hooves splashing through puddles. Captain Thorne's lodgings were on a quiet terrace near Warwick Square. 3 stories of faded yellow brick, the hallway smelling of boiled cabbage and damp plaster. The landlady, Mrs. Finch, showed us up reluctantly. Thorne received us in a small sitting room furnished with campaign relics, a brass-bound campaign chest, a rolled prayer mat, a curved tulwar above the mantel. The fire was low. The room felt cold, despite it. He stood, leaning on a stick, scar, livid in the gaslight. "You've been asking questions," he said flatly. I've nothing to add." Holmes seated himself without invitation. "You offered Edmund Hargrove a cigarette on the night he died. Turkish tobacco. He coughed after smoking it." Thorne's jaw tightened. Polite gesture. He accepted. Many men cough on first draw of a strong blend. Yet his watch stopped at 11:30, roughly the time needed for prussic acid to act if administered in minute but lethal quantity. Such poison can be conveyed in smoke if the cigarette is treated, dipped or dusted with crystals dissolved in alcohol, then dried. A muscle twitched in Thorne's cheek. "You accuse me." "I observe. Your boots bore upstream clay the morning after. You were unaccounted for between 11:30 and 2. Your limp worsened that night, as though you had carried weight." Thorne sat heavily. That I walked the embankment after leaving the club. The fog was thick. I heard a cry near the bridge. Thought it had drunk. I went down the steps, slipped on the mud, wrenched my bad leg. Found nothing. Went home. His eyes did not meet ours. I felt the temperature in the room drop further. From Pimlico, we proceeded to Mayfair once more, this time calling on Lord Ashford at his house rather than his study. He met us in a drawing-room, heavy with velvet and gilt, the air thick with rose perfume from a bowl of forced blooms, and the sweeter note of his wife's scent lingering after she had left the room. Ashford was affable, almost too much so. "My alibi stands, gentlemen. 4 witnesses, all peers or knights. I never left the card table." "Yet you argued heatedly with Edmund over railway guarantees," Holmes said. "And you possess Indian connections, enough to fear exposure." Ashford laughed, short and sharp. "Exposure of what? Legitimate business. The boy was naive. If someone silenced him, it was not I." His cufflinks that day were plain gold. No princely crest. But on a side table lay a small enamelled box of Turkish cigarettes. Our penultimate call was to Victor Crane's office as dusk fell. Rain drummed on the skylight above the print shop. The presses had fallen silent for the day, leaving only the smell of cooling metal and drying ink. Crane looked tired, sleeves rolled, ink still on his fingers. "I told you I was here till 1. Proofs don't correct themselves." "Yet you pressed Edmund hardest for the letters," Holmes observed. "A scoop like that could make or break a journalist." Crane shrugged. "It could, but I don't kill for stories. I write them." He offered us tea from a stained pot. The brew was bitter, stewed too long. As we left, Holmes paused in the doorway. "You visited Blackwood's studio the day after the death, inquiring after negatives. Why?" Crane hesitated. "Professional interest. If Hargrove photographed documents, I wanted them." The final visit was brief. Blackwood again, now alone in his studio. The chemical reek was stronger in the evening. Acetic acid, sharp enough to sting the eyes. He admitted Crane had called, but denied handing over any plates. Holmes left a card. Should any negatives surface, you will inform me at once. We returned to Baker Street as the lamps were being lit, rain still falling in silver rods past the window. Holmes paced before the fire, pipe smoke curling in slow spirals. The room felt close. The scent of wet wool from our coats mingling with tobacco and the faint char of burned coal. 3 men with opportunity. 3 with motive. Financial ruin for Ashford. Lost scoop for Crane. Pension and reputation for Thorne. Yet each had produced some form of defense, some thread of alibi or denial. False leads abounded. The Turkish cigarette, the upstream mud, the missing negatives. The net was closing, but slowly, and I could feel the tension building, like the barometer before a storm. 3 men had dined with Edmund Hargrove that night. 3 had reason to wish him silent. Which would you name the murderer, given what we knew then? Holmes stopped pacing and stared into the flames. Tomorrow we press harder, he said quietly. The truth is near, Watson. It only requires the right question in the right ear. Outside, the rain continued to fall, drumming steadily on the slates above us, as though the city itself were impatient for revelation. Chapter 5. The Pursuit. The rain had eased to a fine, persistent drizzle by the following morning, turning the London streets into slick, reflective ribbons under a sky the colour of wet slate. The air carried the clean bite of falling water, mixed with the ever-present Thames odour. Brackish, faintly fishy, overlaid now with the sharp smell of wet coal from 100 chimneys. Holmes was up before dawn. I found him at the breakfast table, studying a small map of the embankment and surrounding streets, his coffee untouched, pipe already drawing steadily. "Today we move quickly, Watson," he said without preamble. "Thorne's account of slipping on the mud ring's false. His landlady confirmed the coat was sodden and heavy when he returned, far heavier than rain alone would account for. And the cigarette? He admitted offering it. We press him again, this time with evidence in hand." We took a hansom to Pimlico at once. The horses' hooves splashed through shallow puddles, the driver's oilskin cape glistened darkly. Warwick Square was quiet, save for the steady drip from plane trees and the distant clatter of milk carts. Mrs. Finch opened the door with a wary eye. "Captain Thorne went out an hour ago, gentlemen. Said he had urgent business at the War Office. Took a cab toward Victoria." Holmes's mouth tightened. "Describe the cab." "Black hansom, number 472. The driver had a red muffler." We hailed another cab and gave chase, directing the driver toward Victoria Station. The streets were busy with morning traffic, omnibuses lumbering, clerks hurrying under umbrellas, the sharp crack of whips and the low rumble of iron wheels on stone. At Victoria, we found no sign of Thorne, but a porter remembered a tall, limping man in a military greatcoat taking the Underground toward Charing Cross. "Headed east, sir. Looked in a hurry." We descended into the Underground ourselves, the platform thick with the smell of hot iron, steam, and the acrid bite of coal smoke from the engines. The train rattled in with a shriek of brakes and a rush of warm, sooty air. We boarded the first carriage and stood gripping the straps as it lurched eastward. At Charing Cross, we emerged into daylight, or what passed for it, beneath the low clouds, and hurried toward the embankment. Holmes moved with purpose, eyes scanning every face. Near the Hungerford steps, he paused, pointing to fresh footprints in the thin mud at the water's edge, long strides, one slightly dragging. "Thorne's limp," he said. "He came here after leaving Pimlico. Why return to the scene unless something remains to be retrieved or destroyed?" We followed the prints upstream along the foreshore. The tide, still low enough to expose the glistening banks. The mud was cold and yielding underfoot, sucking at our boots with wet, reluctant sounds. Gulls rose in a cloud of white wings, crying harshly. Halfway to Waterloo Bridge, Holmes stopped abruptly. There, half buried in the silt, lay a small oilskin packet, sodden but intact. Holmes lifted it carefully with his stick and unfolded the wrapping. And inside were several sheets of thin notepaper, photographic negatives, and one original letter bearing an Indian princely seal. The ink had run slightly from the damp, but the text was legible. References to guaranteed payments and discreet handling of War Office objections. Edmund's insurance, Holmes murmured. Thorne must have taken the originals from the body, but overlooked these, or believed them lost in the river. He came back to search. The discovery was interrupted by a shout from the bridge above. We looked up to see Captain Thorne leaning over the parapet, face pale, eyes wide. For a moment he stood frozen. Then he turned and limped rapidly toward the northern approach. "The game is afoot!" Holmes cried, and we scrambled up the slippery steps to the roadway. Thorne had a lead of perhaps 50 yards. He moved surprisingly fast, despite the limp, dodging between hansoms and pedestrians, greatcoat flapping. We pursued along the embankment, the drizzle turning to steady rain that stung our faces. Horns blared. A costermonger's barrow nearly overturned as Thorne shoved past. My lungs burned. Holmes ran ahead, long legs eating the distance. Thorne darted into a narrow alley off Villiers Street, lined with warehouses and small chandlers. The air here smelled of tar, rope, and wet timber. Crates were stacked against walls. Ropes hung in coils from iron hooks. We followed into the gloom. At the far end, Thorne wrenched open a side door into an empty warehouse. High rafters, dusty shafts of light from broken skylights, the floor littered with old sacks and coiled chains. He turned at bay near a stack of barrels, breathing hard, a hand inside his coat. "Enough!" Holmes said, stopping 10 paces away. "You cannot outrun the truth, Captain." Thorne's hand emerged, holding a small service revolver, steady despite the tremor in his arm. Rain dripped from the eaves outside, a steady patter on corrugated iron. "You've no proof," he rasped. "Accident. The Yard said so." "The Yard did not find the prussic acid file," Holmes replied calmly, "nor the treated cigarette you offered him, nor these negatives, which show payments authorized through your office to secure silence on the railway bribes. Edmund confronted you at dinner. Quietly, perhaps, but you acted later, a cigarette laced with hydrocyanic crystals, enough to weaken, not kill, outright. Then a walk along the bridge, a grip on the collar, a push as the convulsions began. The mud on your boots, the tear in his cuff, and the weight your landlady felt in your coat when you returned. All speak." Thorne's face worked. "He would have ruined me. My pension, everything. The letters name me." The stakes had risen sharply, a loaded revolver pointed at Holmes's chest. The warehouse felt suddenly colder, the air thick with dust and the faint metallic scent of old machinery. I edged forward, heart hammering. "Put it down, Thorne," I said. "There is still a chance." He laughed, short and bitter. "No chance. Only the river again." In that suspended moment, Holmes spoke softly. "You recall the Leadenhall Street poisoning case, Watson? The broker who thought poison in a cigar would leave no trace. The residue on his fingers betrayed him. Here, the cigarette ash in Hargrove's pocket matched the blend Thorne smokes. The chain is complete." Thorne's hand wavered. Then, with a groan, he lowered the revolver and sank to his knees among the sacks. I confess I was utterly confounded by the sudden turn. Holmes had pieced it together, while I still saw only fragments. I wonder if you, dear reader, had already glimpsed the truth amid the pursuit. We secured the weapon and the packet. Outside, the rain had stopped. A watery sun broke through, touching the river with silver. The truth was close now. Very close. Chapter 6. The Past Speaks. The capture of Captain Elias Thorne in the warehouse off Villiers Street marked a turning point, yet the full weight of the matter settled slowly, like sediment stirred from the riverbed. We escorted him back to Baker Street under the watchful eye of 2 plainclothes constables summoned by whistle from the embankment. The rain had ceased entirely. A pale afternoon sun broke through ragged clouds, casting long shadows across the wet pavements. The air smelled freshly laundered, with only the faintest trace of Thames rot lingering beneath the scent of damp stone and horse manure. Thorne sat handcuffed in the growler cab between the constables, head bowed, the scar on his cheek stark against his pallor. He spoke not a word during the journey. Holmes rode opposite, silent, eyes fixed on the prisoner with that cool, unblinking regard that had broken stronger men. I sat beside Holmes, the oilskin packet of negatives and the recovered letter resting heavy in my coat pocket. At 2:21, Mrs. Hudson met us at the door, eyes widening at the sight of the uniformed men and their charge. She asked no questions. Years of strange comings and goings had taught her discretion. But she busied herself with tea and sandwiches in the sitting room, while the constables took Thorne downstairs to the small back parlour we sometimes used for such purposes. Once settled, Holmes wasted no time. He spread the recovered documents on the table, the original letter with its princely seal, the negatives showing payments authorised through the War Office's Indian desk, and a ledger extract naming Thorne as the conduit for certain discretionary funds meant to secure railway concessions. The ink had bled slightly from the river water, but the meaning was clear. "You were the intermediary," Holmes said quietly. "Edmund Hargrove discovered the bribes when reviewing old files in Calcutta. Yeah, he brought copies home, intending to expose the corruption. Quietly, perhaps through his uncle, perhaps through Crane's newspaper. But he confronted you first at dinner. You realized the danger to your pension and your reputation." Thorne stared at the papers without lifting his head. His voice, when it came, was hoarse. "I served 22 years in Bengal. Wounds, fever, heat that would kill a lesser man. The pension was all I had left. The letters named me, explicitly. If they reached the press or Parliament, I would be ruined, disgraced, court-martialed, perhaps." Holmes leaned back in his chair, fingertips together. "So you acted. The Turkish cigarette, treated with a minute quantity of hydrocyanic acid crystals dissolved in alcohol, allowed to dry. Enough to induce convulsions within 20 minutes, and not enough to kill outright in that dose. You offered it politely. He smoked half, felt the first effects, left the club early. You followed, caught him on the bridge approach, supported him as though helping a drunken friend. When the spasms began, you gripped the collar, hence the tear, dragged him to the upstream steps where the current would carry him under the bridge, and pushed." Thorne's shoulders rose and fell. "He was already dying. I only hastened matters, made it look like an accident." The motive stood revealed in stark relief. Not passion, not greed in the ordinary sense, but the desperate preservation of a lifetime's service reduced to a monthly check. The past spoke through every word. Years of discipline, loyalty to the crown, and the bitter knowledge that the same crown would discard him without hesitation if scandal attached. I poured brandy. The glass clinked softly against the decanter. The fire crackled, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. Outside, the afternoon light slanted through the windows, touching the Persian rugs with gold. "You searched his pockets for the originals," Holmes continued. "Found them, but missed the oilskin packet he had hidden in an inner lining. Perhaps the very lining you tore in your haste. You carried the weight home. Your landlady felt it in the sodden coat. The upstream mud on your boots completed the trail." Thorne lifted his head at last. His eyes were dull, defeated. "I thought the river would take care of the rest. It usually does." Connections formed swiftly now that the centre had been exposed. The Turkish blend Thorne favoured matched the ash in Edmund's pocket. The file fragments bore traces of the same acid used in photographic developing. Thorne had purchased it openly from Blackwood's supplier under pretext of experimenting with lantern slides. The limp had worsened from the exertion of dragging a convulsing man. The cry the waterman heard was not Edmund's final gasp, but Thorn's grunt of effort as he shoved. Sir Reginald arrived within the hour, summoned by telegram. He stood in the doorway, ulster still damp, face ashen, as he listened to Holmes's quiet recital. When Thorn was led away by the constables to Bow Street, Sir Reginald sank into a chair. "My nephew," he said softly. "He died for honour, and I suspected Thorn from the first, yet hesitated to accuse without proof." Holmes inclined his head. The proof is now incontrovertible." As evening drew on, I reflected on the case's shape. A young man's idealism had collided with an older man's fear of penury. The river had been both stage and witness. The pieces connected at last. Cigarette, poison, drag marks in the mud, missing documents, recovered negatives. In hindsight, the signs were there from the beginning. The mismatched clay, the chemical trace, the fibers on the railing. We should have seen the pattern sooner. The room grew quiet, save for the tick of the mantel clock and the low murmur of London beyond the windows. Holmes stood at the casement, pipe in hand, watching the lamps flare to life along Baker Street. The truth had emerged from the shadows, stark and unsparing. Chapter 7. The truth emerges. The evening of Captain Thorn's arrest settled over Baker Street with a peculiar stillness. The rain had returned in earnest, drumming steadily against the window panes and turning the gas lamps outside into blurred halos of yellow. Inside 221B, the fire burned bright, casting long shadows across the Persian rugs and the scattered papers on the table. The air carried the familiar blend of tobacco smoke, damp wool from our coats, and the faint, acrid trace of Holmes's chemical reagents, still lingering from earlier tests on the cigarette stub recovered from Edmund's pocket. Thorn had been conveyed to Bow Street under heavy guard. Inspector Gregson himself had arrived to take formal charge, his face grim beneath the dripping brim of his bowler. Now only Holmes, Sir Reginald Hargrove, and I remained in the sitting room. Sir Reginald sat near the hearth, hands clasped tightly, knuckles white. His ulster lay sodden across a chair, water pooled beneath it in the floorboards. Holmes stood before the mantel, pipe in hand, the bowl glowing faintly as he drew on it. He spoke without preamble, his voice low and measured, as though reciting a conclusion already long formed in his mind. "The cigarette was the vehicle, Sir Reginald. Captain Thorn treated it with prussic acid, crystals dissolved in alcohol. The solution brushed lightly along the paper and allowed to dry. The dose was small, calculated to produce violent convulsions within 20 minutes rather than immediate death. Edmund, smoked half, felt the first burning in his throat, the dizziness, the tightening of the chest. He left the club hastily, perhaps believing himself ill from the fog or the wine." Sir Reginald nodded slowly. "He was never a heavy smoker. The cough Jenkins described, Thorn must have counted on it being dismissed." "Precisely. Thorn followed at a discreet distance. The fog was thick. Few would notice two men walking together on the embankment. When the poison took full effect, near the bridge approach, Edmund staggered. Thorn caught him under the arms, supporting him like a friend aiding a drunkard. But the grip was too tight. It tore the cuff. The chemical residue transferred to the collar from Thorn's fingers, still damp with traces of the solution. Holmes crossed to the table and lifted the recovered oilskin packet. "Here are the proofs Edmund carried as insurance, photographed negatives and one original letter. They detail payments authorized through Thorn's desk at the War Office to silence objections to the railway concessions. Edmund intended to place them before you, or perhaps Crane's newspaper. He confided as much to you the week before." Sir Reginald's voice was rough. "He told me only that the documents were dangerous. He feared for his safety, but would not name names. I pressed him. He laughed it off, said shadows on the bridge were playing on his nerves." "Those shadows had a name," Holmes continued. Thorn waited until the convulsions began in earnest. Gasping, rigid limbs, the characteristic almond scent faint but present. He dragged Edmund to the quieter steps upstream, where the current runs strongest beneath the bridge arches. A final push sent him over. The fall was short, The poison ensured he could not swim or cry out effectively. The body washed downstream to where it was found at dawn. I leaned forward. The watch stopped at 11:30, the moment of the push, perhaps jarring the mechanism, and the upstream mud under the nails and on Thorne's boots. From the drag along the foreshore, Holmes inclined his head. Exactly, Watson. The river mud told its tale plainly once we knew where to look. The fibres on the railing matched Thorne's greatcoat. The file fragments bore his purchase record from the supplier, even the limp worsened by the strain of hauling a convulsing man. Every detail aligns. Sir Reginald rose, pacing to the window and staring out at the rain-lashed street. I suspected Thorne from the beginning, his silence at dinner, the way he watched Edmund, yet I hesitated. Old comradeship, shared service in India, I feared accusing without proof would dishonour both our names. Holmes set his pipe down. You acted correctly in coming to me. Proof is what matters. Thorne has confessed in outline. Gregson will take the full statement tonight. The coroner will reopen the inquest tomorrow. The War Office has been notified discreetly. They will suspend Thorne pending court-martial, though the civilian charge of murder will take precedence. Sir Reginald turned back to us, eyes glistening in the firelight. Edmund died for honour. He might have kept silent, taken a post in the city, lived comfortably. Instead, he chose truth. And paid the price, I said quietly. The room fell silent, save for the steady tick of the mantel clock and the patter of rain. Holmes moved to his violin case, lifted the instrument, and drew the bow once across the strings, a single, mournful note that hung in the air. Nothing in my experience prepared me for the bleak simplicity of this crime, I said at last. A cigarette, a walk in the fog, a push into the river, and a lifetime of service undone by fear of poverty. I wonder how many of you who have followed this account saw the truth before Holmes laid it bare. Sir Reginald bowed his head. I did not fully, but the signs were there. The chemical stain, the mismatched mud, the cigarette ash. In hindsight, we should have known. Holmes replaced the violin without playing further. The truth, when it emerges, is often darker than we expect, and simpler. Thorne will face justice. The documents will be placed before the proper authorities, the bribes exposed, the railway dealings scrutinized. Edmund's name will be cleared of any suggestion of drunken misadventure. Sir Reginald extended his hand first to Holmes, then to me. Gentlemen, you have given me back my nephew's honour. For that, no thanks can suffice. He departed soon after, shoulders straighter, despite the weight of grief. The door closed behind him. With a soft click, Holmes resumed his chair, steepled his fingers, and stared into the fire. A sordid little business, Watson. Greed masked as necessity, murder cloaked as accident. Yet the river gave up its secret in the end. I poured us both brandy. The liquor burned warmly down my throat. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean. The truth had emerged at last, stark, unsparing, complete. Justice had begun. In Chapter 8. Justice. The rain had slackened to a fine mist by the time Inspector Gregson returned to Baker Street the following morning. It was just past 9. The city outside was stirring into its usual rhythm. Hansoms splashing through puddles, the distant clang of milk churns on carts, the low murmur of costermongers calling their wares. Inside, 221B, the sitting room, still held the faint scent of last night's tobacco and the sharper note of wet wool drying by the hearth. Mrs. Hudson had brought up fresh coffee. The pot steamed gently on the side table. Gregson entered without knocking, bowler in hand, his greatcoat dripping onto the rug. His face was set in the grim satisfaction of a man who has closed a difficult file. Thorne has made a full statement, he announced, accepting the coffee Holmes offered. Signed it an hour ago at Bow Street. No denials, no prevarications. He admits purchasing the prussic acid under pretext of photographic work, treating the cigarette in his rooms the afternoon before the dinner, offering it to Hargrove as a strong Turkish blend to clear the head. He followed, waited for the poison to take effect, dragged the lad to the steps, pushed him over when the convulsions made resistance impossible. Claims he meant only to silence him, not kill outright. But the dose was lethal enough once the fall and the river finished the work. Holmes nodded once. And the documents. Recovered from his rooms during the search last night, the originals were in a locked drawer beneath a false bottom, wrapped in oilskin, same as the packet we found on the foreshore. He intended to burn them, but lacked the nerve after the deed. A fear of discovery kept them hidden instead. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp morning air. So, the War Office bribes will come to light. Gregson set his cup down with a decisive clink. Already in hand, Sir Reginald delivered copies to the Home Secretary at first light. The railway concessions are suspended pending inquiry. Several names in Calcutta and Whitehall will answer questions before a select committee. Thorne's pension is forfeit, of course. He'll face the rope if the jury finds premeditation. The word hung in the room like smoke. Premeditation. A single cigarette, a calculated dose, a walk in the fog, and a life extinguished to protect a monthly stipend. The simplicity of it still unsettled me. Gregson cleared his throat. "There's more. Thorne asked to see you, Mr. Holmes, before the magistrate's hearing this afternoon. Said he owed you an explanation. Not an apology, mind, but an explanation." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Curious. Very well. We shall go to Bow Street." The cells beneath Bow Street Magistrates' Court were chill and dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of damp stone, carbolic soap, and the faint metallic tang of iron bars. Thorne sat on a narrow bench in a small holding room, wrists manacled, uniform greatcoat folded beside him. The scar on his cheek looked raw in the gaslight. His eyes were sunken but steady. He rose. When we entered, the constable at the door stepped back to give us privacy. "You've come," Thorne said quietly. "I didn't expect it." Holmes remained standing. "You wished to speak." Thorne drew a slow breath. "I served the Crown faithfully. 22 years. Malaria in the Terai, wounds at Kandahar, nights when the heat alone was enough to drive a man mad. The pension was promised, a small thing, but it was mine. When Hargrove showed me the letters, quietly, over brandy, he said he would give me time to resign, to leave England before exposure. He offered mercy." His voice cracked on the last word. "Mercy. After 30 years of service, mercy from a boy who'd spent 3 years sipping tea in Calcutta offices. I saw my life unravel. Court-martial, disgrace, the workhouse perhaps. I acted, not in rage, in calculation. The cigarette seemed clean, no blood, no struggle. The river would do the rest." He looked directly at Holmes. "You saw it all. The mud, the fibers, the ash. I thought the fog and the tide would cover everything." "I underestimated you." Holmes's expression remained impassive. "You underestimated the evidence the river itself provided. Mud remembers, Captain. So do men like Edmund Hargrove, who keep copies." Thorne gave a short, mirthless laugh. He was better than I, braver. I killed him for nothing. The letters are public now anyway." Silence followed. The constable shifted his weight. Chains clinked softly. "I have no defence," Thorne said at last. "Only this. Tell Sir Reginald I regret the manner, not the necessity. Tell him I was tired." Holmes inclined his head fractionally. "I shall convey your words. Nothing more." We left the cell. Outside, the mist had lifted. Weak sunlight touched the wet cobbles of Bow Street. The magistrate's hearing was brief. Thorne committed for trial at the Old Bailey on the charge of willful murder. Bail was refused. As he was led away in handcuffs, he did not look back. Back at Baker Street, Sir Reginald called again in the afternoon. He brought news. The coroner had amended the inquest verdict to murder by person or persons unknown, pending trial, and Edmund's body would be released for burial in the family plot at Kensal Green. The War Office had already begun internal proceedings against those named in the letters. "I shall attend the funeral," Sir Reginald said, "and see that Edmund's name is remembered with honour." The impact rippled outward. Crane's newspaper ran a restrained account of tragic events on the embankment, hinting at corruption without naming names until official release. Ere Lord Ashford withdrew from the railway board for reasons of health, the club steward Jenkins spoke quietly to friends of the night Edmund left early, coughing. Consequences unfolded steadily, inexorably. A man's life ended, another's ruined, reputations tarnished, secrets dragged into daylight. The river had given up its dead and its truths alike. Holmes stood at the window as evening fell, watching the lamps flare along Baker Street. "Justice, Watson," he said softly, "is seldom tidy, but it arrives in the end." I nodded, the weight of the case settling at last. Nothing in my experience had prepared me for the bleak finality of this resolution. A cigarette in a fog-bound club, a push into black water, and the slow, certain machinery of the law grinding forward. The consequences were unfolding still. But the shadow that had followed Edmund Hargrove across Westminster Bridge had been dispelled at last.